Welcome to the McFeely Mess podcast at Inforum.com. In-depth conversations and opinion covering a variety of topics from the world of news, sports, and more. Here's Mike McFeely.
Welcome to another episode of the McFeely Mess podcast at Inforum.com. Our guest today, it's been too long since he's been our guest, but you all know him, you all love him, and every time I have him on the pod, I get lots of positive feedback. And it's not about me. The feedback is never positive about me, but Clay Jenkinson, our good friend, the humanities scholar, author, researcher, expert in just about everything, who, by the way, had another wonderful newsletter. I think I received it today or yesterday in my inbox, talking about the wild horses of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And that it opened my eyes to just a more, Pat Springer at the Forum has been the guy in the forefront of the reporting of that. But Clay had a wonderful newsletter that I would encourage you all to subscribe to and read, because this kid can write. This Jenkinson kid can write. He's got some good vertical jump. His motor never stops, and he can write a few words that make sense. So I want to welcome in Clay Jenkinson to the podcast. Hello, sir.
How kind and generous you are, my friend Mike. You know, people can go to ltamerica.org. I post every week. I was out in the Badlands about 10 days ago, and I saw the billboards, keep the horses, and trying to shame the National Park Service and so on. I hope they keep the horses. I think the horses are great. But the question I tried to raise in the piece, and people can go see it if they like, is, are the horses livestock or are they wildlife? And the park wants to say they're livestock, and therefore they have no place in a national park. The park's not sure that it wants to get rid of them. It just is really weighing this, and there's a very interesting process. The public is 99.9% in favor of keeping the horses, but all I wanted to say was these are serious questions. These are trained professionals in the Park Service. The process is a very good one. I've seen it in action on the great elk controversy from about 15 years ago. And I would just urge people to be, and this you can't, as you know, Mike, you can never make this happen in America, but to, withhold judgment a little, look into it a little, try to think of both sides. But that's not how things work. As you know, I think the horses will stay, and I hope they stay. I see them as wildlife. The thing that astonishes me, Mike, is that a feral horse, and that's the technical term we're supposed to use, a feral horse in the park can live its entire life without ever being touched by a human being. And that really gives me some joy, because we've domesticated horses and sheep and cows and so on. These horses don't need oats. They don't need hay. Their hooves never get trimmed. They just live. And so it delights me to think that America is big enough for some of that too. And the park concedes that they're not endangering the vegetation. In other words, it's not like some zero-sum game, and if you keep the horses, then the bison starve. Or the park can sustain horses. The question is a formerly wild horse, a feral horse that's now within the park perimeter, is that a natural creature that is there and we should accept that and embrace that? Or like the longhorn cattle in the North Unit, are they something that doesn't really belong in an American national park?
Couple things before we move on. I find it interesting, the verbiage that the National Park System uses, and I'm a supporter of the National Park System, don't get me wrong. They're just such wonderful pieces of America and a legacy that Theodore Roosevelt will always have, and by God, I love him for that. But the verbiage of, they insist on calling them feral horses as opposed to wild horses, because wild horse sounds like an exciting, positive thing when you think about the Old West, a wild horse roaming free, running with the wind, its tail dancing across the landscape, whereas a feral horse sounds like a rat. And it just, the only thing worse would be if they called it the invasive horses.
Or the rabid horses.
Yes. Yes.
So I agree with you about wild and feral. I've been caught up short whenever I've said wild. My friends in the park say, oh. And I hadn't quite thought of it in your terms until this moment. So thank you for that. The wild horse idea, reminds me of song by Michael Martin Murphy, Wildfire, the romance of the Old West, and these horses that roam around in Utah and Wyoming and Colorado. And of course, they are a problem in some places on the BLM lands. I don't think they're a problem in the park. And so maybe we should all agree on nomenclature. It's as with everything else, Mike, it's a political act. Is it feral or is it wild? You had another thought before we move on.
And I don't remember what it was. And so,
right.
we'll move on. Eventually here, I want to get to asking your opinion of a survey that was recently conducted across North Dakota, and my newspaper, The Forum, wrote about it, and it was about Christian nationalism in North Dakota and the way its citizens view Christian nationalism. And we'll get into the details a little bit later, but before we get to that, and maybe this ties into that, you told me before we hit the record button that you wanted to speak to the citizens of North Dakota about their favorite presidential candidate.
People listen to you and people listen to us, and some of them agree with us some of the time, some of them agree with us never. You and I aren't identical, but we're sort of basically the same outlook on life and politics. I just want to say I love and respect North Dakotans. And it really is the case that many of my friends are MAGA people. And that's just something that you learn to work around. They work around me and I work around them. I could never be a MAGA person. But I just wanted to say this to them. So I get it. I get that you don't like Biden and you don't like Democrats and you think that we're moving in a socialist direction. And you're certainly, these people are adamant about guns and gun Second Amendment rights. And they have real doubts about how far to take the welfare state. And they have real concerns about the border. And I think those are legitimate concerns, although we're quite a ways away from that border. I get all that. So in other words, I can see why a good North Dakotan would vote for the Republican as opposed to the Democrat. And you and I have talked about whether Biden's perceived diminution of alertness is a real thing or not. But here's what I want to say to my fellow North Dakotans. Okay, fair enough. And Trump appealed to you. And Trump talks back to the establishment, and Trump wants to get the elites. And you feel some satisfaction in that. Sometimes I do too. But he's claiming it's going to be retribution. That does not seem like a presidential attitude in the United States ever. He says he's going to deport 12 million people. Good luck, honey. That can't be done. You'd have to have a police state unprecedented in world history to figure out where those 12 million people are. Is it 12? Is it 8? Is it 30? To round them up. Imagine the America that would round up between 10 and 20 million people and carry them in vans or trains. I mean, it sounds like something you would see in 1935 or 1937 on the way to a concentration camp. And when he says things like bloodbath and dictator on day one, or maybe it's just dictator for day one, and that he would pardon everyone who trashed the United States Capitol, the litany. I mean, there are things that you could say, these are Trump policies and I don't agree with them, but hey, that's how democracy works. And he might well be reelected, of course. Mm-hmm. But then there are things where you say, what decent, reasonable person could really want to round up 12 million hardworking people and ship them across the border? And what do you think the result would be of that? And what does that say about America and our values as a decent society? And what does he mean by retribution when he talks about jailing his political opponents? This is not within the bounds of the people of North Dakota. In other words, I mean, I have friends who are 401k Republicans who will vote for Trump because it's good for their portfolio. And I have friends who are pro-life and will vote for Trump because he's perceived to be pro-life. I have friends who are pro-gun in a huge way and would vote for anybody except a Democrat because of that. I get all that. Go for it. That makes sense to me. I don't agree with the politics necessarily, but but I believe in majority rule. What I don't get is the creepy thuggishness and felonious language that we now know is not just rhetoric, that when he says that stuff, he's attempting to trigger certain views in the far right. And it wouldn't surprise me if he got the power he wanted, that he would try to expel 12 million or more people. And so that's what I want our North Dakotans to say when they hear this. I want them to make the case that it's okay for that to be the president of the United States. I just listened to Miles Taylor's book, Blowback, which I urge you to listen to or to read. He details such lawlessness. I mean, Donald Trump saying of women pregnant trying to cross the Rio Grande River, he said, "Why don't you shoot them?" And one of his people said, "Well, we really can't shoot them." And he said, "Well, just shoot them in the legs then." But this is a really bad man who believes that violence is a proper tool, and he's a man who's told the border patrolman, "Go ahead and do whatever you want. I'll pardon you." I mean, this can't be okay. And so what I'm asking is give us 10 ardent Trumpites in North Dakota. How do you justify that side of him? We get the other stuff, but how do you justify profoundly un-Christian, un-American, inhumane impulses and actions? And I just don't see, Mike, that anybody can really make that case. You have to hold your nose and cover your eyes and close your ears and just force yourself to jump on board with that set of values. What do you think?
I think that and this is the question I've been asking, and you've been asking, and many
We've been asking for 6 years.
I've been asking for 6 years, and I still haven't got a satisfactory answer. And for me, the question that I've always asked of whether it's not just limited to North Dakota. I live in Minnesota, and rural Minnesota is the same.
Wadena, Rothsay,
it's the same thing. And South Dakota and Wyoming, whatever. I've always asked, what is making these people so angry? Because I think there's anger there, and there's anger in Donald Trump, and there's this, as you said, the idea of retribution, that they want to get back at something or back at somebody. And I don't get out into North Dakota as much as I used to, but I still get out and, I drive to Devil's Lake several times a year, and I still drive to Valley City or, Wahpeton or whatever. And I've said this before. I said this on Joel Heitkamp's program last week when I guest hosted for him. I said, when I look around, I don't see anything that would make me angry. I don't see migrants charging across the plowed fields. I don't see homeless encampments of transgender, gay, migrant Black people outside of Brockett, North Dakota. I don't see any of the things that are supposed to be there that I'm being told are there, and that Fox News and talk radio are telling me are there. I don't see it, and what I see is a beautiful country filled with generally caring people. I have no doubt that if my pickup truck blew a tire on a gravel road in Barnes County, and if a farmer happened along, maybe flying 4 Trump flags on his John Deere, I have no doubt he would stop and help me change my tire. No doubt.
Well, unless you identified yourself, and then he might puncture the other tire.
He would see the Minnesota plates and keep on driving, but that's the whole. But he would help me. He just would, and I would be invited in to have coffee and lunch at his house, and his wife would be wonderful. And so, then the same people are on social media saying that let's go hang Joe Biden because he's a danger to the world, and it doesn't make any sense to me. That's the part that I can't figure out. But they seem to be just enamored with this man when they could get their policy selections from any other Republican, Nikki Haley or Doug Burgum or Tim Scott. They would all do this, push the same policies that Donald Trump was going to push.
Which they're entitled to push if they can win a majority.
Yes,
There's so many people that are equally conservative, if you want to call Trump that, who are essentially respectful of others, who know the process, who are professionals, who don't say crazy stuff. And I mean, Nikki Haley is not my favorite candidate, but she is, she's a correction on Trump. She says, well, we probably can't banish all 12 million people, but I share your concerns. I'm with you, and I drive around North Dakota a lot, and I see prosperity. Now, we have a little homelessness in North Dakota. We have some poverty in North Dakota, and not just on Indian reservations. We have some poverty in Bismarck. We have some poverty everywhere. We have an opioid crisis. We have we have a binge drinking problem in North Dakota. There are issues and we need to face those. And liberals would face them in one way, and conservatives would face them in another way. I get all that. But when I drive around the state, I feel like Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, who said to the British people, "You've never had it so good." I mean, what has Biden done to any North Dakotan? We're in a time of unprecedented prosperity. North Dakota has never been as prosperous as it is now. I'm guessing that's true of northern Minnesota too. And so you think, what are you so upset about? What has you riled up in this way? Because there ain't, as you say, there's no caravan of immigrants coming into Valley City or Breckenridge. And, it just seems to me that the people that are sort of hypnotized, if that's what you want to call it, by this, are breaking their own character, and that there's no need for the rage. I mean, here's what I would say, if you want to say why the rage. Country's been changing very fast. Remember, Barack Obama wasn't comfortable with gay marriage. Suddenly, that changed. Transgender is something that kind of popped on the scene in the last 10 or 12 years. Transgender athletes, certainly, although how many transgender athletes really are there in this country? Is it 12 or is it 30? But I get people that the changes had been so fast, so quick, so hard, so bewildering that you just wish for a simpler world, and somebody comes along and says, I can revert you to Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver and the Dick Van Dyke Show, and that there's an appeal to that. I get it. I feel it, some of it myself. Like, stop the world. It's just so crazy now.
Yeah, me too.
But I get that. And the fear of too much change too fast, and having been left behind after the 2008 crash, I think that people legitimately wanted something else. But I don't think that means you want somebody who wants to shoot pregnant women. And that's just not something he says. Miles Taylor shows that he actually insisted that Homeland Security consider that and do that. And they did everything in their power to slow it down or stop it or talk him out of it or outweigh him. But if they had been yes men to a person, they might have committed just enormous crimes during his presidency, because that's the world he actually believes in. And so, the only way you can justify this, Mike, is if you say he's just a blowhard and he doesn't really mean it, and it's just it's just rhetoric, and sure, we'll be fine. We'll talk him off the ledge. I don't believe that anymore. No. And I don't think it's the character of the people of the heartland of this country. I was in Iowa, and I can't even use these words even on a private podcast, but there was a barn, had two signs on it. One said F Biden, sign, huge, not hand painted. The other one said, I could S a better president than Joe Biden. The 4-letter S word. I could, what? I mean, let's say you felt that. Let's say you or I were a crank and we meet at the Elks Club or the Legion, the Legion, and we talk that way when we've had 4 beers. But who buys that sign, gets up on a ladder and bolts it to I mean, what happened to America that you can say F Biden and I could S a better president?
And we're getting down in the weeds here, but the other part of that, and I've seen similar signs, of course, driving through rural Minnesota. People have them on their vehicles. They're all over the place, right? I understand if you're a Republican and Joe Biden is a Democrat and you just don't like the policies and you're afraid he's going to raise your taxes and you don't want taxes to go to poor Black people in St. Louis or whatever your thing is, right?
But those could be legitimate concerns that people have. You and I might disagree, but those could be legitimate concerns.
Correct. Or if you're a farmer and you think that the federal government has too many regulations on you and it's cutting into your bottom line. I understand that. You and I, or not you and I, but the listener out there and I might think differently, that I believe it's important to have clean water. He says, I don't really care because you're taking 10% off my bottom line. Everybody else is doing it anyway. Screw that, whatever. We can have that debate, that discussion. But in anybody's world, historically or any other way, is Joe Biden a man that is like worthy of those types of words and those types of insults? He's done nothing in his life that would warrant that sort of hatred and that sort of, I mean, those are words and those are feelings that you would reserve for Pol Pot or Fidel Castro or God forbid, Vladimir Putin, but Joe Biden, he's an American. He just has different political views, and he hasn't been a bad president. He hasn't Herbert Hoovered this thing. He just hasn't. He's not Richard Nixon. He didn't S all over the Constitution. And I mean, Joe Biden is just a man who loves America and has different policy ideas than some guy from Gackle. And
that's what elections are about, defeat that. Yes. and put the other people in power. The second round of that is, Donald Trump saying that Hamas has genius. I mean, that would destroy any political life of any other person in America, or the cozying up. Those things are just, for me, that's just totally bewildering. It's bewildering that Donald Trump would be beholden in the way that he is. I kind of could maybe try to explain it if I worked hard enough about it. I get maybe that, but I don't get why somebody living in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, could think that those are responsible statements from somebody who would be the leader of the free world.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, and the mystery continues. And on November, 8th or whatever it is, this year, you and I might be having a podcast going, what just happened?
From prison, but I just want to ask the people who are listening, because we have conservatives who listen to us partly because they're intrigued, partly because they just want to hate. But I would just ask them, what has Biden done to you? Number one. Yeah, there was the inflation, and we get all that, but that's really beyond any presidency. Number two, are you okay with a president who says that he's going to be a dictator, maybe on or maybe for day one? Are you okay with a person who can say that the president is not fully human? Really? Is that just rhetoric? And so I want them to explain it. I don't want them to say, "Oh, there you guys go again." I want someone to say, "Yeah, it's okay. I'm okay with deporting 12 million people." And then you want to say to them, if you were Socrates, "Okay, why don't you work that out? How many National Guardsmen are you going to need? How many trucks? How many tanks? How many trains? Really, let's work that out as a plan." Because every time there's a border reform bill or an immigration reform bill, it always miscarries on grandfathering people in, because the conservatives say, and I get it, why should we reward people who crossed illegally and didn't play by the rules? I have deep sympathy with that point of view, Mike. Well, what's the remedy? There is only one remedy, to say those who are in. Maybe we make them pay a fine, or do a naturalization test, or whatever, cross the border and come back. But there's no way in the world that you could get rid of those people, assuming you could find them. And so, sure, I understand the feeling that we're being invaded. I don't agree with it. I think the border is a colossal disgrace to this country in both parties, one worse than the other. But I just don't see why anyone who is a reasonable human being, and most of these people that I know are very reasonable human beings in most ways, could really think that's a solution to anything.
Okay, we'll throw it out there.
Maybe they'll make a case that you and I will have to agree makes some sense.
There'll be a light bulb that comes on that goes bing.
The world would be so glad if you became a John Birch conservative overnight. You say, "You're right, by Godfrey."
Perfect segue. Perfect segue. You're a pro at this, because the reason I wanted to have you on, or one of the reasons, is the story that I referenced earlier in the forum, based off a survey that was conducted across North Dakota that showed that North Dakota is number one in the country. Congratulations, North Dakota. You are number one in the number of people who agree or are sympathetic to Christian nationalism. According to a survey, 50% of North Dakotans are in agreement with or sympathetic to the idea of Christian nationalism, which is, of course, that the nation should be run by the Bible, by Christian religion, that we're a Christian country, et cetera, et cetera. 50% of North Dakotans believe, yes, that is what we should do, as compared to the national average, which is 33%. And of course, the numbers are skewed toward Republicans and skewed toward Trump supporters and skewed toward Christians, obviously. I have some other numbers I want to share with you, Clay, but just in general, when you hear those numbers, when you read that story, when you were talking about this over coffee with people, what was your reaction? Were you surprised?
I love North Dakota. I'm a deep North Dakota patriot. As you know, I've written books about it. My most recent one was The Language of Cottonwoods. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure North Dakota out. And I think I sort of understand North Dakota. And I really have the deepest affection and respect for my fellow North Dakotans. And I always say to you when we have this conversation, there are 550,000 of them and about 12 of us. And so it's their state as much as ours, more in many respects. Yes. And so one must respect that. That's the will of the people. And you could say they're misinformed or, they're whatever. But the fact is, they're entitled to their view of the world. I get nationalism and I get Christian. I don't get the combination exactly. So, Christian nationalism sort of is a cousin to white supremacist. There's a great book that I recommend. I'm a big fan of Tim Alberta. And I've told you before about his book, American Carnage, which I think is the best book to try to explain MAGA and Trump and so on, and a very fair one, I think. Now he has a new book called The Kingdom and the Power and the Glory. And he grew up in an evangelical world. He himself is an evangelical. And he's trying to figure out, how did this happen? How did the evangelical strain in American life connect itself with this kind of far-right, nationalist, white supremacist stuff? And it's a fascinating thing. They regard Trump as their Solomon. Like he's a sinner, but Solomon was a sinner and God was able to use him to do good things. Okay, I don't agree with that as Bible history or theology, but I can understand why they might give him a mulligan, as they love to say. But we are a largely Christian nation, although not much less than people, I think, want to believe. North Dakotans are largely Christian people. They're a very church-going people, so I get that. And a lot of people that I've been working on Jefferson all my life, and people say, we're a Christian nation, not a secular nation. Well, we're a Christian nation demographically, but we're a secular nation constitutionally. And there's a serious gap between those two things. I don't, I'd need to know a lot more about this before I really became too alarmed by it. I think it's kind of, let me put it this way, and I hope this doesn't sound condescending to my fellow North Dakotans. We're so far from Gaza. We're so far from London, from Los Angeles, from New York, from New Orleans. We're really isolated out here. And we don't have a kind of global view very much because most North Dakotans are deep heartlanders. And so we can be bewildered and appalled by things that never really touch us. And so I think Christian nationalism has to be seen as whatever it's not. It's not secular humanism. It's not sort of a generous view of new Americans, which always strikes me as wonderfully odd because North Dakota, of course, was once 71% immigrant. Mm-hmm. If there's a state that was filled by immigrants at the end of the 19th century, it was the state of North Dakota and eastern Montana. So it always strikes me as a little weird that we shut the door and now we want to padlock it too. I hope North Dakotans really aren't Christian nationalists. I think that's just one of those kind of weasel phrases, frankly. And to the extent that it is, I would like to see what that means in terms of policy. Okay, let's say that you, Mike, are a Christian nationalist. What are the 10 things you want to do there? Do you want to have a Muslim ban because that's not Christian? Do you want to build a 5,000-foot wall on the border? I mean, what are the implications of being a Christian nationalist?
Okay, now wait, because those two things that you just said, those ideas have been raised in the state of North Dakota, in the legislature, and others have as well. We're talking about keeping out refugees. Well, that's not based on the fact that they're white Christians from Sweden. It's based on the fact that they're darker skinned people from Africa or Asia or some other place. And so that has been raised. If you're talking about banning LGBTQ people, that has been raised in the state of North Dakota. If you're talking about, having to post the 10 commandments on the wall of public schools, I don't know if that's specifically been raised in North Dakota, but it would not surprise me if it has been. And so, and these ideas, yours and mine, that we've just put out there, have also been raised in other states, conservative and so-called blue states, by Republicans that never had a chance because they're controlled by Democratic politicians. But these ideas have all been raised, Clay. So I don't know that it's that far out of the realm of possibility that a majority of North Dakotans, or at least half, a plurality of North Dakotans, identify with Christian nationalism. Let me read a couple things here. So the survey respondents were asked to which degree they agreed or disagreed with the following statements, okay? The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. We have had North Dakota politicians raise that idea. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. We hear that all the time, right? That, we're a God-fearing people and we're a Christian nation. We're founded on Christianity. We hear that all the time. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Now, what do we hear constantly on talk radio, on Fox News, from the mouth of Donald Trump? We're losing our country. We're going to take our country back. So we hear that constantly. Being Christian is an important part of truly being an American. Okay? We've heard that before, right? That this is a Christian nation. Muslims need to get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
Yep. And the last one was, God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society.
Wow, that's a lot. A couple things. One is that we do have a wall of separation between church and state. I know something about the U.S. Constitution. God is never mentioned. Divinity is never mentioned. Providence is never mentioned. Jesus is never mentioned. And the only thing that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights say is that there shall be no law establishing a state religion in America. So the founding fathers they may have been Christians, but they were pretty adamant that this was going to be a secular constitutional system. And I know people don't believe that. Everywhere I go, people say, the founding fathers intended a Christian nation. And I'm kind of an expert in this one. And I say, well, show me, let's see the documents, because the documents don't tend that way. So that's one thing. And so that shows some, at least, ignorance of the intentions of the founders. But more than that, Mike, it shows a misunderstanding of the reason behind that. Because everywhere there have been state churches in the world, they wind up being state tyrannies in bed with bad governments and so on. And so the founding fathers, particularly Jefferson and Madison, wanted to separate these two things so that you could be a Methodist or a Lutheran or a Quaker or whatever. But as a citizen, that was a separate category. And I think that was absolutely right. And that's why we have such a great proliferation of religious sensibilities, churches, and cults in the United States. So I think there's some honest ignorance about our history there. I think the horse has left the barn on diversity, I do understand why many white Americans are anxious about the browning of America. I truly do, because they have an idea of America, and really their idea is a white America in which non-white people are sort of allowed, but they don't really have an idea that everyone is legitimate. And of course, they grew up in a whiter America. And so they're watching all this change, and they think that the Democrats are just throwing open the borders and begging people to come in and bringing undesirable people and trying to damage the country. Maybe it's replacement theory. I don't know what. But I can understand people's anxiety about the browning of America. I don't know what we do about it, but I can understand it. What I don't get is how this is Christian. If you take that man, say Jesus, would he be for a retribution tour of the country? Would he be for expelling 12 million people? Would he be for shooting people at the border? Would he be in favor of the autocrats of the world, like Vladimir Putin? Of course not. And so, what does Christianity mean if Christianity is ugly, retributive, racist, nationalist? All of those values are precisely what Jesus wasn't. And so you really have to warp the idea of Christian to do this. And Mike, I gave this talk before Lutherans a couple of years ago. It was fantastic. I met most of the Western Lutheran pastors of the state, and they said they barely know what to do on a Sunday, because if they so much as say anything that could be construed as anti-Trump, their parishioners want to get rid of them, and they shout, and they pull their money from the church. And so these pastors are Christians, and they believe that a Christian, there's a pretty understandable Christian view of the world. Mm-hmm. And their parishioners are no longer really espousing a Christian view of the world, except in sort of personal salvation. But they can't raise this question because they live in fear of backlash, of blowback. And so, many of them are leaving the church. Many of them are just giving the most harmless sort of sermons, like, let's try to be good to each other. And, and that's all they've got now. But if they say, what would Jesus do about something? Everyone sits up in the pew and starts to get a little edgy. Don't be going after our man here. That does not seem Christian to me. That seems something else. And so I think Christian doesn't really mean what Christian means. Nationalism. I'm a nationalist. Of course I'm a nationalist. I love this country. But I don't think that nationalism means that in this crowd. I think nationalism means keep the undesirables out and protect white people in every aspect of life.
First of all, I would love to be the promoter of the Jesus Christ Retribution Tour. That would be something. I'm sure I could get him at the Fargo Dome. I know people there. He probably wouldn't bail on Grand Forks like the Jonas Brothers did, so you could probably get him up there too.
Right.
That would be something. Fire from the fingertips, water to wine.
You and I could be the warm-up act. Please welcome Jesus Christ.
Ladies and gentlemen.
You've been waiting all night. You've listened to these two knuckleheads. Now, the man you came to see, the Christ. And let us talk about a wall on the Mexican border.
The beer sales will be through the roof. What a profitable tour. From a practical standpoint, though, I want to say this, and is the other states that had high percentages of people who were supportive of Christian nationalism.
You mean Hawaii and Massachusetts and California, don't you?
No, I don't, as a matter of fact. I mean, number 2 on the list, behind North Dakota, Mississippi.
Huh.
Number 3 on the list, behind North Dakota and Mississippi, Alabama.
Those are the cousins I want to go.
47%. Next, West Virginia.
Alabama, Mississippi, West Virginia, those enlightened states.
And number 5, Louisiana.
Louisiana.
So when I think about this, a couple things pop into my head, that it was just 14 years ago that North Dakota was represented in Congress by 3 Democrats, Byron Dorgan, Kent Conrad, and Earl Pomeroy.
And where are they now?
Oh, they are They are waiting for the Jesus Christ Retribution tour because they're wanting to be entertained by something. They're no longer in Washington. So that's how far the state has, in my view, fallen. In other people's views, advanced, whatever. But that's the change in North Dakota in a relatively short amount of time. The other thing is, and you referenced this already, for years when I was on KFGO radio, I jokingly would say, boy, North Dakota they're really trying hard to become the northern Mississippi. Like, this is North Alabama. And I said it jokingly. That's where the state is headed, Clay. I mean, if those types of people are going to govern the state, and there is all kinds of evidence that indeed Sandy Sanford on down, those people are taking over the Republican Party in North Dakota. By those people, I mean evangelicals, right-wing evangelicals. If they're going to be governing the state and making the rules, then what's going to stop North Dakota from having the worst health care, the worst education system, the poorest people, just the fattest people, the most illiterate people? Those states that are behind North Dakota on this list, all of those states rank incredibly terrible in all of those metrics. Is North Dakota going to head that way? Is that what's in the future if the state believes in white Christian or in Christian nationalism?
Well, beware what you ask for, Mike, because I think that they're going to get it. So your daughter and my daughter and tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of young, really interesting North Dakotans are going to opt out of the state because they're going to say, if I can live anywhere, why would I live in a state that passes these sorts of laws? My daughter has said that to me a number of times, and she's appalled by what the legislature of North Dakota is doing. And so we're going to become a white supremacist Christian nationalist place because we'll bleed out everyone who doesn't want to live in that world, and we'll be stuck with and some will move here in order to be of that world. But on the day after the election, when I see the map and you see like the blue coasts and you see then the Illinois and Colorado and New Mexico and a few other sort of maybe blue places, and then you look at the red, it's North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, mostly Texas, and then it's Arkansas, Mississippi. And every time this happens, I say, I don't want North Dakota to be a part of that club. We're better than that. Small C conservative, bring it. Fiscal conservative, fine. Concerned about socialized healthcare, okay. All those things are fine by me, but the bigotry, the rage, the hatred, the racism, the righteousness, the mean-spiritedness, the creating bogeys and then legislating against them when it's not really even a problem. I mean, name some transgender athletes in the state of North Dakota, for example. When I see that, I think that's not a North Dakota I any longer recognize. That's what I used to think of Mississippi, and now we're their cousin. And I think we're better than that. I don't know if you think we're better than that, but I do think we're better than that.
I do, except when I look in the face of facts, it's a little tough to make a case that North Dakota is any better than that. The only difference between North Dakota and those other places we've talked about is that it is a damn sight colder here than it is in Alabama or Mississippi. And so when you talk about young people moving away, and you're right, in the modern world and surely in the world moving forward, hell, I could go live in Florida right now and do my job. I mean, I don't need to live here. I live here because I live in Minnesota. I've been here my whole life. This is where my family is. I don't think I'm going to go anyplace. But if I wanted,
walleye is.
Yeah. But if I wanted to, I could live anywhere else in this country and do my job well enough. And so could you, and so could thousands of other people. The trouble is that there ain't going to be people moving here to work here, even if they think it's a Christian white nationalist paradise, because it gets to be 30 below here in December, January, and February, and you're not going to have anybody moving here, Clay. And they can, Doug Burgum and Kelly Armstrong and Tammy Miller and everybody else can talk about how, who's the dingbat from TV that they're trot out, Mr. Wonderful, Kevin O'Leary, that idiot. They can say all they want about how it's great. This is a great place for workers and there's all these jobs and it's a great place to do business, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't matter because it's 30 below in December, January, and February. And you mix in the white Christian nationalism, then what person under the age of 50 is going to want to move here? That's a serious concern.
I agree. We're propped up in North Dakota by the farm program. And if I were a farmer, I would never complain about the federal farm program. It's guaranteed your future on a farm unless you go out of your way to screw up. But it's now foolproof if you are a reasonably good farmer. That wasn't the case before the 1980s. Correct. And you remember how awful those were. So we've now propped up the ag sector until there's great economic stability, which is the main thing, but also prosperity in farm country. I drive around and, people built new homes in 1974 after the big wheat year. You should see the new homes out there now. These are $850,000 to $2 million homes. People are prospering as ever before. And we've propped the state up with oil revenues. We're on kind of I think whatever skepticism people may have, we're on a short time scale on carbon. The carbon industry is not sustainable for another century in North Dakota, maybe for half a century, maybe for a quarter of a century. Take those two elements out, federal propping up of the state through the farm program, and then the almost unbelievable windfall profits that have come thanks to the oil booms. What's left? And people move here now because there are jobs. If there are no jobs, and of course robotic agriculture is coming too, they're not going to move here. If you get the choice between moving to Arkansas or North Dakota, then your 30 below is going to be the main factor. So I agree with that. But I also just want to say to my fellow North Dakotans, most of whom disagree with us, have you ever had it this good? Has life ever been as good as it is right now? There's a Costco within 2.5 hours. There are, Dollar General stores everywhere. The roads are good. Our schools are good thanks to oil revenues. Our universities are, as usual, annoying everybody, but they're doing their job. This is a great time in the history of the heartland, at least up on the northern Great Plains. And if we think we're going to attract people with the kind of legislation that comes out of our state legislature, we're not. And that means that there's going to be a brain shrink, and there's going to be a creativity shrink. And if this were for some good reason, if this were worth fighting about, I might be with them, but it's for no good reason. Take this, for example. If you're worried about the browning of America, tough, it's coming. I mean, and it's not new people.
Well, it's already here.
It's here, and it's only going to become much, much, much more. And so there's no stopping that. If you're worried about Muslim Americans, well, there are about 4 million of them. We're not exporting these people, and they mind their own business, and they're on the whole extraordinarily good citizens. So the bogeys are false bogeys, but people buy into them every time instead of thinking hard about what's really going on in America. And there are lots of problems. They think if it's all about these caravans at the border, it's all about these thugs that are crossing. It's the terrorists who are sneaking in our porous borders. It's the Democrats with their health care. But remember, when the Republicans had all three branches of government, they did not repeal and replace Obamacare because the people like it.
Right.
And it's never going away. And we're going to have universal health care. I'll say one more thing about Christian nationalism.
And Clay, I apologize. I need to cut you off because I'm at my time limit. So next time we do this, we can get deeper into what we want to talk about. And also, my lovely wife is walking in my house right now. And so,
all right, but let me say this much. I believe the Supreme Court's going to reverse the prayer in schools bans. And we're going to see a return to prayer in schools and public places in the next 10 years.
Well, that's a nice place to leave it.
Well, we'll discuss it next time.
Thank you, sir, as always. Fantastic.
I love you. And really, to my friends in North Dakota, we love you. I do, at least. Tell us why you want to support this guy.
Thank you. Clay Jenkinson, our guy here on the McFeely Mess podcast. Thank you all for listening. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks for listening to the McFeely Mess podcast at Inforum.com. For more podcasts and columns, head to inforum.com and search Mike McFeely.